Okay, my name is Gene Maddox. I am chairman of the board of the George Clem Multicultural Alliance. It's a community organization here in Greeneville, community service, and we do a number of things, Black History, the Martin Luther King celebration, and the biggest event, I suppose, that we do yearly is the 8th of August celebration. The 8th of August is the commemoration of freedom for slaves in Tennessee. It was necessary because the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Abraham Lincoln in January of 1863 did not apply to slaves in Tennessee. The proclamation freed the slaves in the states that were in conflict with the North. The 8th of August, you'll notice, is 8 months later. And as I said, because the proclamation of Lincoln did not apply to slaves in Tennessee. It applied to all the slaves in the states that were in conflict with the North. It did not free slaves in the border states such as Maryland, Kentucky, or Missouri, and certain other enclaves. But Tennessee is the only state that was actually in conflict with the North that didn't have its slaves freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. It fell to the military governor at the time, Andrew Johnson, to free the slaves. Actually, the slaves were actually not freed in Tennessee until October of 1863. But you'll notice the date is August 8th, the date in which we're celebrating. It's not the actual date of freeing all the slaves in Tennessee. It was in October 64, as I just stated. But it was the date that Andrew Johnson freed his 8 to 10 slaves that he owned personally. It was a manumission, a personal act of freeing your own property, as slaves were considered at that time. That date, however, became symbolic as the beginning of freedom for slaves in Tennessee. And the celebration on 8th of August has come to be celebrated widely in Tennessee at the time. I think it's the celebrating of the 8th spread from the mountains here in the east all the way across the state, across the Mississippi to Missouri, to the west, and all the way up to the Ohio River in the north. I'm really not clear about the origins of where initially blacks came into Greene County. I know that going back to frontier times, that I think that possibly that most African Americans in this here in East Tennessee came as slaves and with the slave owners. A lot of Scotch Irish moved into the area, and people from, I guess, every group came in, and I think possibly they brought slaves with them. I'm not clear as to how many free blacks would have been in this frontier region initially, but I just feel that from everything that I've heard and read, they came in as slaves. I think that possibly that people who settled along this Appalachian chain were, for some reason, they were Methodists, they were Presbyterians, and they were not all slave owners. This area is the terrain, the topography is not conducive to large plantations where you see a lot of intense labor is needed to, maintain the large populations, such as further south in the Delta, where you have large plantations that demanded a lot of labor. The people settling in this area, because of their religion, because of economics, and were not large slaveholding, was not a large slaveholding community. those people had moved, on out to Middle Tennessee, down into the Delta, Mississippi, and places such as that. So the people remaining here were small farmers with conditions that didn't call for large slave holdings. Now there were slaves here, there were domestic slaves, but also, for I guess due to the same reason, the people here were more loyal to the Union, and at the time prior to the Civil War during the 1850s and later, that because of the cotton gin, there was, I guess, more intense interest in cotton production, which called for a large labor force. And since, as I said, since this was not conducive to those crops that needed, large labor, a large labor force, then the people here were, as I said, not interested or didn't need, a large labor force. And as I said, the religion played a part in this, so there was not a large slave-holding community here. And as I said earlier, these people were more sympathetic to the Union. The people who settled here for various reasons were not large slaveholders and were somewhat didn't have the same interest in slavery that the areas in the South that did need large slaveholders to maintain their economic base. So there was a large sympathy at the beginning of and during and prior to the war for the maintaining of the Union. There was a lot of Union sympathy. There was even some anti-slavery sympathy here. And I think which made it a place that people of African Americans would want to come to. During the Civil War, I think Union sympathy was much as 2/3 to 70%. So post-Civil War, I think would have a lot of people wanting to settle here because they felt this atmosphere would be conducive for a better life for African Americans. Also, this was a part of the Underground Railroad. So you have a lot of people coming out of North Carolina, coming up through Knoxville, on the way to up through Kentucky to the Ohio River where they would find freedom. So I'm imagining that a lot of people settled here. And so the community here, I'm thinking early on would have been a good place for African Americans coming here, having a destination to live here. They thought they would have a better life, and as I said, if not to, move up north. So I think life here early on would have been, relatively speaking, maybe a better place as compared to the surrounding areas here in East Tennessee. So I think that a lot of people remained here. I know that there's some history of people coming here to make a life, to work in education for the newly freed blacks, and I think they probably imagined that would be a good future here. So even down to more recent years, I know that the right to vote was available to blacks here early on. And living here during those years myself, I knew that we would watch the civil rights struggle on TV and see the struggle that people had for the South and just, earning the right to vote. So life here, even though segregation existed, there was widespread separation here too. But I'm thinking this is part of the Up South. So people living here didn't experience some of the hard struggles that we witnessed during the civil rights struggle. But, segregation is segregation, and it did exist here. Well, the 8th of August, I moved to Greeneville about 2 years old, and we moved here from Western North Carolina. But one thing that we noticed is this 8th of August celebration that we knew nothing about. And we said, well, what is the 8th of August? And they said, well, this was when the slaves were freed. And so at that point, I said, oh yeah, great. And so people would celebrate. They would celebrate with maybe a picnic on the 8th of August. The following Sunday, there would be big programs at the various churches in the African American community. But usually on the evening of the 8th of August, there would be probably a big dance. And people would celebrate in that way. And we know that this celebration had been going on and had become a very strong tradition here in East Tennessee with African Americans, especially here in East Tennessee. Greeneville was where the 8th of August originated with the freeing of the Andrew Johnson's first 8 to 10 slaves, and that has remained a strong tradition here ever since. The earliest documented evidence that we have of the 8th of August celebration is from a newspaper article of 1871 in which African Americans gathered together, marching downtown on horseback, walking, riding in wagons, assembling downtown, and then continuing with a parade to Tusculum College, where former President Andrew Johnson addressed the assembly. And of course, that is the first documented evidence that we have, but we think that possibly it started earlier than that. This was one occasion that made it into the newspapers. But we know that since that time, there's been various newspaper articles and stories handed down of really great celebrations here. There's stories of people renting whole trains and coming from Knoxville to celebrate here in Greeneville. And at one time, I think I mentioned earlier here that the celebration spread from here in the east all the way to the Mississippi and Ohio rivers in the west and the north. But that tradition is still strong here. Even today in East Tennessee, we still continue to celebrate. The George Clem Multicultural Alliance has taken on the responsibility recently in the last maybe 15 years of doing the 8th of August celebration. Prior to that, earlier groups, the NAACP, the local chapter, took that on in the 70s and 80s, and going back beyond that, various groups and the community took on the responsibility after the 8th of August. As going back and just thinking about in the 50s and earlier when people started, when education for blacks began to provide better education for blacks here in Greeneville. The job market here was pretty much domestic work for blacks, and people started to be a part of the migration up north and to move away from Greeneville to go north for better jobs. But during the 8th of August, they would come back to Greeneville to celebrate with family and friends and to maintain that really strong tradition of celebrating the 8th of August. In fact, I would say that it was Black Independence Day in Tennessee. The tradition across the state has somewhat dwindled to just celebrating here in East Tennessee, primarily in Cocke County, Greene County, Washington County, Newport, Greeneville, Johnson City. And of late, there's been interest, there's been a resurgence in the Knoxville area, but that is all to say that especially here in East Tennessee, it's been a strong tradition because freedom was important, and today with a lot of things that's going on today, I think it's really good to look at the strong tradition here in Greeneville and really understand what it means, and it means a lot to people here. And as I said, there's been some resurgence in the Knoxville area, and I think that's not separated from a lot of things that's going on today with the Black Lives Matter movement and things such as that that's going on now. Yeah, the Negro Women's Civic Club was an organization started, I suppose, in the late 40s, early 50s here by the women, African American women here in Greeneville. As you know, during segregation, black communities were pretty much self-contained, being segregated, so we had to have our own communities and our own various organizations, strong churches and organizations. The Negro Women's Civic Club was really a community service organization akin to sorority work. They did a lot of things that needed to be done in the African American community, in helping children, helping the community, and a lot of civic work. One of the great things that they accomplished in this segregated community at the time was establish some recreational activities, a lot of civic luncheons, just a lot of community work. I think one of the greatest deeds that most people will remember is the building of a swimming pool in this community. It was built adjacent to the George Clem School. That was the African American school that all African American students, even in the county and the city here, attended during the 50s. During the summer, they worked, raised funds, and built a modern facility at the time, a swimming pool, which all African Americans used. And I can remember in the summertime going to the pool to celebrate. There was a jukebox there, and being on the George Clem and the swimming pool was sort of located on a hill. That when the jukebox was going, you could sort of hear it all over the community, and all the kids would get together and go to the pool to celebrate. And during the summers, when people who moved away were sending their grandkids to vacation here in the summer, and it was a great time when everybody would get together and celebrate at the pool. You know, this is a small community. And so you would have kids from up north, you'd have kids from here, from out in the county, all getting together for really some memorable times in the African American community. This was all done and sponsored solely by the Negro Women's Civic Club. The building is still standing in the African American community, and it's been, of course, that organization has sort of faded away, and those people are gone but well remembered now. The George Clem Multicultural Alliance has taken on that facility. They built a really nice facility for meetings and activities in the community. The George Clem group has taken that on and has had it open for community activities. A lot of our 8th of August activities take place there, a lot of community work, but it remains the Negro Women's Civic Club, the name we keep in a memorial to that group that did so much for the community. And most of those women have gone on, but very well remembered. In celebrating the 8th of August, I also want to say that in continuing to celebrate what we feel is such an important part of our history, not only here in Greeneville, but certainly a part of here in Greeneville, but it's for the whole state. We want to continue to celebrate, which we will and are doing. We've been able to enlist the aid of the city of Greeneville, other institutions, the school system, the city, the Parks and Recreation, various church groups all through the community, Tusculum College, East Tennessee State University. So we have a lot of support. We want to continue this, and we want, even though this history is not widely known outside of the African American community, we're endeavoring to make it more publicly known and diverse. We've invited the whole community. We want to work with the school system to put this into the public domain. We want to work with the school system that not only African American students will know about this important historical event, but all students. So as we go into the future, we want to work with, the whole diverse community to continue to commemorate what we feel is a very important part of Tennessee history. Venues large enough for such a celebration for African Americans was the tobacco warehouses, and the one in particular was Bernard's number 2, which is adjacent to the Andrew Johnson home, and sort of appropriate since President Johnson was pretty much responsible for this celebration, that it would be close to his home. As I said, we'd bring in bands and have just really a great dance. And this was largely celebrated by African Americans, but we would have larger contingents of white people who would come to watch, the latest dances and celebrate. And I think they would go home and really practice some of the dances, I've been told later, but that is the way the whole community participated, and there were many, many dances held. As a matter of fact, going back to the wider celebrating of the 8th of August across Tennessee, it's been reported that Louis Armstrong, back in 1935, as he was getting well known, played for 8th of August celebration in Memphis. But we do know that he did do that. And spreading across Tennessee, I'm sure there were a lot of really memorable occasions during the 8th of August. But here in Greeneville, most of it was at this tobacco warehouse, and there have been a lot of people who related a lot of great memories to, to these wonderful celebrations.
Nice.
There are some stories that we hear about Andrew Johnson's slaves, and one of the slaves that Andrew Johnson purchased in 1842 in Parisville was Sam Johnson. And Sam Johnson was quite a dapper dresser. He was educated. I understand he played the violin, and really was quite the figure. At the time, one of the stories that has come down is that slave owners could hire their slaves out to various other people to do work. There was a relative of Johnson, Andrew Johnson's, who would have Sam to do work for her, and I understand that one day she said, Sam, I want you to do such and such a job for me. And he goes, no. And I think she's horrified because slaves just didn't talk to, slave owners or other people in that manner. And she goes, what? And he goes, you don't pay enough. And that was firm. No, he wasn't going to do it. And they would go back and possibly complain to Johnson. And evidently Johnson and Sam Johnson had a very, very important connection. Johnson wouldn't do it, President Johnson wouldn't do anything about it, so Sam was sort of his own man, and so stories like this, does come down to us. There was a William Andrew Johnson who lived in the Knoxville area during the 30s, and at one time someone asked him, during slavery you sort of had everything provided for you. After slavery, what was it like? And I think William said, well, possibly that's true, but nothing is worse than being owned by someone else. So I think even though a lot of African Americans probably had to get out and work on their own, they were free, and that meant a lot. And that's why I think the 8th of August celebration is still so important. One of the many stories that come down to us is from, I think, William Andrew Johnson, who was quite a figure in Knoxville. In fact, one of the stories is the Kane story. And one time President Roosevelt, during the 30s when the TVA project was being constructed here in East Tennessee, he came to visit a facility. When William Andrew Johnson heard about this, being a former slave of Andrew Johnson, he wanted to meet the president. And so when the president came, that opportunity never happened. But one of the national correspondents wrote an article in which Roosevelt read about, was it Ernie Powell? Yeah, was a columnist, and he put this in a column. President Roosevelt reads about this and says, well, I'd like to meet that fellow, sends a Secret Service agent to Knoxville to pick up William Andrew Johnson, invites him to the audience at the White House, presents him with a cane, silver-headed cane, with Johnson's initials and FDR's initial. That cane went into the Johnson family, William Andrew Johnson's family, and was reported to have been in a museum here in Greeneville, but had disappeared. A researcher of the 8th of August, Bill Merrill, was able to run that cane down up in Louisville, Kentucky, through a descendant of William Andrew Johnson, of Sam Johnson, and who actually had the cane, and it's been brought to Greeneville by Ned Otter, the descendant, and he has been, as a descendant of one of the slaves freed by Andrew Johnson, has been honored at our 8th of August celebration here in Greeneville, and I think last year at Parisville. One of the other stories that Andrew Johnson relates is how Andrew Johnson come to own slaves. There was a slave auction in Parisville, Tennessee, in Cocke County, that Johnson attended in 1842. And at that slave was some of the slaves to be sold was this slave, Dolly. And she was walking around looking at all the slave holders or buyers. She seen Andrew Johnson and evidently thought he looked to be a kind person. For some reason she went up to him and said, would you buy me? Which he did. So he starts back to bring her to Greeneville. She said, wait, I have a half brother, Sam Johnson, would you go back and buy him too? Which is reported he did. So he brings Dolly and Sam to Greeneville as his slaves, and of course I've related Sam Johnson's living as a slave here in Greeneville under Andrew Johnson. So that's one of the many stories that's come down to us, but that is one of how possibly Andrew Johnson came to own slaves. So we can't verify that, but it has been passed down, I've told, by William Andrew Johnson. Yeah, I'm sure that August 8th would have been such an important event to people here in Greeneville and all over Tennessee that surely it must have started earlier than 1871. I think that's when a newspaper picked it up, but I'm sure in 1866, 67, a lot of things were happening, and I'm sure there were other celebrations prior to this 1871 publication. And I know, in fact, that it did continue pretty much unbroken down until today. Well, Sam Johnson is credited for some reason of its spreading. I think the 8th of August celebration spread to other communities throughout to West Tennessee, up through Kentucky and to other areas, especially. I think there's a celebration in Paducah, Kentucky that's celebrated. I know people from Kentucky who have come to Greeneville said they celebrated the 8th of August in various other communities beyond Tennessee, such as in Missouri. I think the celebration spread it as black people gained more education, started to migrate north and to the west. I think they also carried this all-important celebration with them to the other communities. So I think this tradition of celebrating the 8th of August spread west and to the north as African Americans, after gaining more education, going north for work. I think they carried this strong tradition of celebrating the 8th of August as they migrated west and north, and they're endeavoring to find jobs and work and expand their horizons to move to other places. They carried this all-important tradition with them. Also, that is something that we've taken on, that we need to continue to spread this. And as you know, dropped off in some areas, I think we need to endeavor to spread it again. I think the future of this celebration is important for us to continue to pass it on to our youth, not only African American youth, but to all the youth, especially here in Tennessee. I think this is a story of note that is worth knowing by all Tennesseans and beyond Tennessee. I think this is a wonderful American story. Just as Juneteenth and some of the other celebrations are celebrated more nationally, we want to see that happen with the 8th of August. We want to make it a noteworthy celebration nationally as well as here regionally. And as I said, we want to put this in the public domain in our school systems, and maybe someday to have it a part of core curriculums in our school as a part of diverse history.